Within every human lies a map, a hidden design etched into the soul, waiting to be uncovered. Beyond the surface of daily roles and identities, deeper truths whisper through symbols, dreams, and patterns that repeat across time. This journey invites you to uncover those inner forces, your archetypes, and to awaken the true self that has always been there, guiding you in silence. The journey into the depths of the self begins, not with looking inward, but by observing what we show to the world. Carl Jung termed this external-facing dimension of the psyche the persona, a Latin word meaning mask. Just as an actor in ancient Roman theatre would wear a mask to signify their role on stage, so too does the human being wear psychological masks to play the roles demanded by society. We wear them at work, at home, among friends, in public, and even when alone. The persona is our social identity. It is the carefully crafted image we present in order to function smoothly in the world, to be accepted, to be respected, and often to be admired. But is not the totality of who we are. It is not our true self. In the early stages of psychological development, the persona is useful, essential, even. It allows us to integrate into family, school, and culture. We adopt certain traits and repress others to meet the expectations of parents, teachers, and communities. The obedient child, the dutiful student, the charismatic leader. Each identity shaped not solely from within, but also in response to external demands. The persona facilitates participation in the collective life of society, which is a necessary part of human existence. Without it, we would remain primitive and disconnected, alienated from the structures of civilization. Yet the danger arises when the mask begins to stick to the skin, when the individual begins to believe that the persona is the self. In such cases, the true self is buried under layers of performance. We become imprisoned in our roles, defined by what others see and expect, rather than by our inner truths. A person may become the eternal pleaser, forever cheerful and accommodating, hiding anxiety and resentment. Another may wear the mask of the intellectual, constantly appearing logical and composed, while suppressing emotion and vulnerability. These masks, while protective, become suffocating. They estrange us from ourselves. Jung cautioned that identification with the persona leads to a one-sided, hollow existence. In his view, the ego, our conscious sense of identity, must eventually confront the fact that it is not the whole self. It is merely the tip of the iceberg, a fragment of the psyche. When the persona is mistaken for the self, we suffer from spiritual stagnation. We live in accordance with expectations, not authenticity. Life becomes performative, shallow, and eventually unsatisfying. To recognize the persona is the first act of inner liberation. It is a process of discernment, of asking difficult questions. Who am I when I am not performing? What roles have I adopted to be liked, to be safe, to be admired? What parts of myself have I disowned in the process? This kind of introspection is not encouraged in modern life. Society rewards the well-polished mask. It does not reward the messy, unfiltered truth of being. But Jungian psychology demands that we step beyond appearances and seek the essence beneath the surface. The process of disidentifying from the persona does not mean we discard it entirely. That would be both foolish and impossible. We need roles. We need social functioning. What Jung advocated for was not the elimination of the persona, but the realization that it is just a part of us, not the whole. Once we see it as a tool rather than a prison, we can begin to act from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. We wear the mask when appropriate, but we also know when to remove it. In dreams, the persona may appear as a suit of clothing, a mirror, a stranger's face, or even as a character in a masquerade. It is symbolic of conformity, image, and the part of ourselves that is constantly managing impressions. These dreams are invitations to examine the ways we hide and to begin the work of stripping away false layers. The more we become aware of the persona's influence, the more we realize how much of our energy has gone into maintaining an identity that is not truly ours. To move closer to the truth of who we are, Carl Jung insisted that we must journey into the depths of what he called the shadow, the dark, repressed, and denied aspects of the Psyche. The shadow is not evil in itself, but rather everything within us that we have not accepted, acknowledged, or integrated. It is the opposite of the persona. If the persona is the mask we wear in daylight, the shadow is the unlit basement of our psychological house. It contains emotions, impulses, and instincts that do not conform to the image we wish to project, and so we hide them, not only from others but from ourselves. The shadow begins to form early in life. As we grow up and learn which behaviors and emotions are rewarded and which are punished, we start to divide ourselves. We may be taught that anger is bad, so we repress our rage. Or we may be told that sadness is weakness, so we bury our grief. These disowned parts of ourselves do not disappear. They are simply driven underground into the unconscious. Over time, the more we repress, the larger the shadow becomes. It gathers shame, fear, guilt, jealousy, pride, cruelty, lust, and vulnerability. Yet within that darkness, Jung believed, lies an immense reservoir of energy, creativity, and authenticity waiting to be reclaimed. Confronting the shadow is not a comfortable task. It challenges the image we have carefully constructed. It brings to the surface the parts of ourselves we least want to see. And yet, it is only by facing the shadow that we become whole. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That darkness is not only individual but also collective. We carry shadows that belong to our families, cultures, religions, and societies. To encounter our shadow is to encounter the pain and fear we have inherited, often unconsciously. This confrontation usually begins with projection. We see in others what we cannot admit in ourselves. If we harbor aggression but deny it, we may be constantly annoyed by the anger of others. If we suppress envy, we may judge those who appear successful. Projection is the mind's way of defending the ego from the uncomfortable truth that these undesirable qualities are within us. The path of individuation, the journey toward the true self, requires that we withdraw our projections and examine the emotions and judgments that triggered them. When we find ourselves overreacting to another person, we must ask, what part of me is being activated? The shadow often emerges in dreams as frightening figures, monsters, or antagonists. Jung saw these symbols not as enemies, but as guides. They represent the energy of the repressed. The monster may be terrifying, but it is also an invitation. The villain may be threatening, but it also holds a message. The more we run from these figures, the more power they have over us. But when we stop running and listen, when we ask what they want, we begin the process of integration. We discover that what we feared was not evil. It was a part of ourselves that had been abandoned and was crying to be seen. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim power. It does not mean acting out every desire or impulse, but recognizing them, understanding their origins, and choosing consciously how to express them. An integrated person does not live in denial but in awareness. They are not ruled by the shadow, but they are not afraid of it either. This person has depth, dimension, and moral complexity. They are less reactive, less judgmental, more grounded. They no longer need to pretend to be purely good, because they have come to terms with their own capacity for both light and darkness. In the myths and fairy tales that Jung studied, the hero always journeys into the underworld, the cave, or the forest, symbols of the unconscious, where they face trials and dangers. These stories are metaphors for shadow work. The dragon must be faced, the beast must be tamed, the mirror must be looked into. Only then can the treasure be found. The treasure is the self, no longer divided, no longer fragmented, but whole. And yet, even in wholeness, the shadow remains a companion. It does not vanish, it becomes integrated, a source of strength rather than shame. Carl Jung taught that within every human being lies both masculine and feminine psychological energies. He named these inner counterparts the Anima and the Animus. For Jung, the Anima is the feminine soul image within the male unconscious, while the Animus is the masculine soul image within the female unconscious. These archetypes are not mere social constructs, nor are they simply traits of gender identity. Rather, they are deep psychic structures, inherited patterns that help shape how we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the world. To know the true self, one must come to terms with these inner polarities. The integration of Anima and Animus is not about becoming androgynous in a literal sense, but about unifying the fragmented psyche into a dynamic wholeness. The Anima, when unconscious, may appear in dreams or projections as the seductive muse, the spiritual guide, or the destructive siren. In its negative form, it distorts a man's emotional life, making him moody, irrational, overly sentimental, or dependent on female approval. He may worship women unrealistically, or harbor deep resentment and mistrust. This imbalance reflects a disconnection from his own inner feminine qualities: intuition, vulnerability, empathy, and receptivity. The Anima, when developed, becomes a bridge between the ego and the deeper unconscious, leading him toward inner transformation, emotional depth, and soulful awareness. She is the inner guide who can lead him, not toward passivity, but toward meaning. Likewise, the Animus manifests in the female psyche as a collective image of masculinity. In its unrefined state, the Animus may dominate a woman's mind with rigid logic, stubborn opinions, or authoritarian tendencies. She may find herself driven by ideals that do not belong to her, or by voices within that diminish her worth. The negative animus becomes the inner critic, the cold intellectual, the voice of the father or society that says, "You must," or "You cannot." But when she confronts and integrates this energy, it transforms into inner strength, focused thought, discernment, and spiritual clarity. The conscious animus becomes her guide toward individuation, helping her act in the world with conviction and purpose. These archetypes are not fixed by biological sex. A man may need to integrate his inner masculine just as much as his feminine. A woman may discover that she holds both a nurturing anima and a bold animus within. The task of individuation is to recognize the presence of both forces and to harmonize them, so that neither dominates nor is rejected. This inner alchemy requires awareness, humility, and patience. One must listen to the dream images, observe emotional reactions, and explore unconscious projections onto partners, parents, and public figures. Often, we project our inner anima or animus onto those around us, especially romantic partners. We fall in love, not just with the person, but with what they mirror from our psyche. The enchantment of romance is, in part, the enchantment of meeting our own soul image. Jung believed that this projection, while powerful, must eventually be withdrawn and reintegrated. Otherwise, we remain bound to illusion, constantly disappointed by the gap between fantasy and reality. By recognizing that the ideal lover or the cruel critic lives within, we retrieve our power and begin to nurture a conscious relationship with our own inner figures. In dreams, myths, and fantasies, the anima may appear as the goddess, the maiden, or the sorceress. The animus may emerge as the wise old man, the warrior, or the king. These images are not literal. They are symbols pointing to inner potentials that have not yet been fully lived. To embrace these archetypes is to accept the full spectrum of one's humanity. The union of anima and animus within the self is depicted in countless traditions and symbols. In alchemy, it is the sacred marriage of soul and lunar. In Eastern thought, it is the balance of yin and yang. In the tarot, it is the lover's card, symbolizing not just external romance, but internal union. Jung saw this integration as a step toward wholeness, the reconciliation of opposites that gives birth to the self. When the anima and animus are no longer externalized but accepted within, one becomes more internally balanced. Feelings and reason, intuition and logic, passivity and action, these cease to be conflicting forces and become partners in a greater symphony. The true self emerges from this harmony, no longer divided by rigid roles or unconscious projections, but able to navigate life with psychological completeness and depth. Among the most profound and elusive of Carl Jung's archetypes is the self. Unlike the ego, which is the center of conscious identity, the self represents the entirety of the psyche. It is the sum of all conscious and unconscious elements within an individual. Jung viewed the self not as an idea or ideal, but as a living archetype, deeply rooted in the collective unconscious, manifesting throughout human experience in dreams, myths, symbols, and numinous experiences. While the ego gives us a sense of I, the self encompasses everything we are, including what we do not yet know about ourselves. To encounter the self is to stand at the threshold of wholeness, where all opposites, light and dark, masculine and feminine, personal and collective, begin to converge and find harmony. Jung often expressed the self through symbolic imagery, particularly the mandala, a geometric figure, typically circular, that represents unity, totality, and the ordering principle of the Psyche. These mandalas appeared not only in his patients' dreams and drawings, but also in his own private journals, such as the Red Book. For Jung, these spontaneous images were not just art or therapy, but sacred maps pointing toward the self. The circle, with its balanced symmetry and center point, mirrors the archetypal structure of the self-da that organizes the personality around an unseen but deeply felt core. Jung emphasized that these symbols arise naturally from the unconscious, and when they appear in our dreams or creative expressions, they are often a sign that the self is making itself known. However, the self is not easily accessed. It does not yield its wisdom to casual inquiry. It often appears at pivotal moments in life, during crises, profound change, spiritual awakenings, or deep psychological work. One does not seek the self through will alone. Instead, the self often seeks us. It may call us through feelings of emptiness, existential questions, or uncanny synchronicities that seem to break the veil between the inner and outer worlds. These synchronistic experiences, meaningful coincidences without a causal link, were central to Jung's understanding of how the self operates. When events in the outer world correspond with inner psychological states, it may be a sign that the self is orchestrating a deeper narrative of meaning. Dreams are a primary medium through which the self communicates. Jung observed that dreams involving wise old men or women, divine children, sacred animals, or universal symbols such as the cross, circle, or tree often herald the presence of the self. Such dreams may evoke awe or confusion, but they are significant. The self, unlike the ego, does not speak in linear language. It communicates in symbols, metaphors, and paradoxes. Its messages are not commands, but invitations to integrate, to transcend, to awaken. Yet this process is not always pleasant. The ego, accustomed to control and identity, often resists the call of the self. The encounter with the self can feel like a dissolution of what we thought we were, a painful but necessary death of the ego's illusion of supremacy. Moreover, the self is not static, it is dynamic, evolving with the individual's psychological development. It is both the origin and the goal of psychic life, what Jung called the transcendent function, which bridges opposites and fosters inner transformation. The self represents our fullest potential, not in terms of worldly success, but in the integration of all aspects of our being. This includes not only what is admirable, but also what is hidden, contradictory, or wounded. In this sense, the self is the ultimate healer, the bringing reconciliation between the disparate parts of our inner life. It is the archetype that pulls us toward individuation, the process of becoming a unified and authentic whole. At the heart of Carl Jung's depth psychology lies the profound concept of individuation. It is not merely the development of personality or the refinement of character, but the sacred inner journey toward becoming a whole, integrated human being. The path of individuation is the path of uncovering, confronting, and integrating all aspects of the psyche. The conscious ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious, so that one may realize the self, the totality of one's being. This process does not offer quick rewards or external validations. Rather, it demands radical honesty, deep reflection, and a willingness to descend into the unknown corners of the soul. Individuation begins when the ego recognizes that it is not the master of the house. The ego, which represents the conscious mind, often believes it is in control. It sets goals, forms judgments, constructs identity, and navigates society. But beneath the ego lies the unconscious, a vast reservoir of forgotten memories, suppressed desires, inherited myths, and primal instincts. The moment the ego encounters the limits of its power, through crisis, conflict, or introspection, it is invited to turn inward and begin the dialogue with the unconscious. Dreams, synchronicities, symbols, and emotional triggers become the language of this dialogue. This inward journey is not linear or comfortable. One must pass through the realm of the shadow, the aspects of the self that have been denied, repressed, or unlived. The shadow may manifest in dreams as frightening figures, or in life as projections onto enemies, rivals, or strangers. As Jung warned, those who fail to recognize their shadow are condemned to be controlled by it from the dark. But to confront the shadow is not to become consumed by it. It is to acknowledge its presence, to accept that one is not entirely virtuous or conscious, and to reclaim the energy locked within it. Often, the shadow contains gifts: assertiveness, creativity, sexual energy, or power, that were once deemed unacceptable and cast away. After engaging the shadow, one may encounter deeper layers of the psyche. The archetypes. These are the primordial images inherited from the collective unconscious. They include the Great Mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the hero, and, as discussed earlier, the Anima and Animus. These figures are not mere psychological concepts. They are living realities within the psyche that shape our dreams, myths, relationships, and decisions. The ego must learn to relate to them, not as literal beings, but as symbolic guides and obstacles in the inner landscape. Each archetype has a light and dark aspect, a constructive and destructive potential, and individuation requires the development of discernment in navigating them. As one deepens into the work, the self begins to emerge. The self is not the same as the ego. It is the center and circumference of the psyche, the totality that includes both the conscious and unconscious. It appears in dreams as mandalas, wise figures, or radiant symbols of unity. When one begins to live from the self, life gains a new orientation, not toward success, conformity, or approval, but toward authenticity, meaning, and inner harmony. The individual becomes less driven by external standards and more attuned to the inner compass. Paradoxically, this often leads to a more genuine contribution to the world, as one brings forth their unique essence, rather than a borrowed mask. But individuation is not isolation. It is not a retreat into self-absorption or narcissism. It is, rather, the foundation of real relationship. Because only a whole person can truly meet another as a whole person. Jung believed that only through individuation can one become truly ethical? Because one is no longer acting out unconscious projections or collective norms, but choosing with awareness. The individuated person accepts both light and darkness, both joy and suffering, and learns to walk the middle path between opposites. This inner journey often brings one into conflict with outer structures, family, religion, a culture, because the individuating soul refuses to be bound by dogma or superficial roles. Yet, this very tension is the crucible in which the self is forged. Individuation is a lifelong process. It does not end with a single insight or achievement. It unfolds through stages, cycles, and crises. It is marked by periods of solitude, transformation, and return. The myths of the hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, the death and rebirth of the soul, all speak to this process. Jung often turned to alchemical symbols to illustrate individuation: the nigredo of dissolution, the albedo of purification, the rubedo of integration. These were not just mystical stages, but psychological realities, mapping the inner evolution of consciousness. As one walks the path of individuation, they come to know not only their personal story, but also the story of humanity itself. The personal and the archetypal, the temporal and the eternal, begin to weave together in a tapestry of meaning, giving rise to a life that is both deeply individual and universally human. To walk the path of self-realization is to confront not only the light within, but also the shadow that guards it. As each archetype reveals its truth, we come closer to wholeness. Not by rejecting parts of ourselves, but by integrating them with honesty and courage. The true self is not a fixed identity, but a living, evolving force shaped by awareness, conflict, and meaning. Only when we recognize the myth we are living can we step into it fully, not as victims of fate, but as conscious participants in the unfolding story of the soul.